Evening, everybody. It's terrific to be here and talking about Cleveland baseball. Last night was a premiere showing of a new film called War on the Diamond. It's all about Ray Chapman and the what happened in 1920 when Ray was hit by a pitch ball and unfortunately passed away early in the morning. So we were all there watching, and Paul Dolan, the owner of the Indians, was there, and he was speaking and introducing the film. And I'm kind of quoting him. If I hope he doesn't get too a little miffed on that. But he did say that he was disappointed to be there, and what he meant was he was hoping to be at a playoff game with the Indians instead of being there at the movie. And I felt very much the same thing. I can empathize. I was rather have been watching TV to see the Indians at New York or at Boston and battling in the wild card game and trying to get to deeper in the playoffs. That wasn't to be this year. But I do understand from what I'm hearing and seeing that the Indians plan to increase the payroll somewhat, and maybe they can land the big time hitter they need in the outfield to really complement the ball club. And if the pitching stays healthy next year, we might have a shot then in 2022, but we're going to have to wait a few months to see how that turns out. Tonight, we're talking about the Cleveland Indians in the 40s through the World War II years up to 1949. I think we all remember in 1948, the team was able to win a pennant and also go on to win the World Series. It was a long process with a war going on, but quite a bit happened in that time that I'm going to go over tonight and talk about some of the highlights. And if we could see our next slide. See if that works. We can get to our next slide or not. Okay. Yeah, that was part of our technical difficulty getting the PowerPoint to work, but I don't see that it's working at the moment. But in 1941, in the fall, there was a lot of uncertainty, especially in the United States and all around the world. War was raging in Europe. Germany had conquered much of Eastern Europe, and they were attacking Great Britain. And there was a tremendous anxiety in the United States about, would we go and defend our great ally, Britain? Would we send ships and troops over there? People were talking about it every day in the fall and wondered what was going to happen in the future and going ahead. At the same time, in Cleveland, there was a different uncertainty in that the Indians were looking for a new manager. Their manager had been Roger Peckinpah in the 1941 season. Peck had been associated with Cleveland for many, many years as a ball player from 1911 to about 1914 as a shortstop, and then over to the Yankees, and then into managing some ball clubs, where in 41, he was hired by Alva Bradley to run the ball club. Peck and Bradley had a good relationship, and for 1942, Peck was to move into the front office to be the next general manager. He'd be in charge of assembling the team and making the trades and the salary negotiations. So a new manager was needed. And generally back then, and it happens a lot today, the managers you choose from are guys that have been involved in baseball for many, many years, guys who are in their 40s up to their mid 60s. And this year, a guy who was 75 years old, Tony La Russa. But some of the Indians board of directors, especially the gentleman from Sherwin-Williams, he wanted some young blood, and he lobbied very hard that Mr. Bradley think about it carefully and maybe choose a young man to be the new manager. As it happened, Lou Boudreau was our shortstop, the starter for the last 2 years. He was just 24 years old, awfully young to be a manager, but Lou decided to send a letter to Mr. Bradley and throw his hat in the ring. And once he did it, he had second thoughts. He told his friends that, I think I made a mistake. I'm not ready to manage. I'm still a young guy, I need some experience. And he thought about going to the post office and trying to get his letter back. Well, that wasn't going to happen, but his friends told him, don't worry about it. Mr. Bradley will get the letter. He'll send you a letter back, be very polite and say, thanks for your interest, Lou, but you're a young ball player, and I think your manager career is probably a few years ahead there, but thanks very much for applying for the job. So he thought about that and said, yeah, probably right. And he went about what he was doing. But to his surprise, the letter that came asked him to come to Cleveland for an interview. And Lou interviewed and impressed everybody he spoke to. And the gentleman who was lobbying for Sherwin-Williams, the stockholder, really put the pressure on everybody in the front office, and they decided to take a leap of faith and hire Lou Boudreau to be player manager of the Cleveland Indians. Lou, as I mentioned, was 24 years old, the youngest in baseball, one of the youngest ever to assume a managerial role. And Lou had his work cut out for him because most of his players were older than him. He'd have to earn their respect. And there were some difficult guys to deal with on the Indians. Jeff Heath was the main guy. He was our outfielder, a really good ball player, an all-around guy that could hit home runs and RBIs. He led the American League in triples a couple times, nearly won a batting title. But Heath was difficult to manage. Heath would hold out every year for more money, miss a lot of spring training, if not all of it. In previous years, he had gone into the stands and punched a fan. He had thrown a bat in the stands and hit the editor of the Cleveland Press with it. And he threatened his manager, Oscar Vitt, to beat him up in front of everybody in the dugout. So he was a problem player, but a really good one, and Boudreau had to find a way to deal with him. Another was Roy Weatherly, our other outfielder, who had the nickname of Stormy, and it wasn't because of his last name, Weatherly. He had a bad temper. In 41 in September, he got into it with manager Peckinpah, and Peck suspended him and sent him home for the rest of the season. These would be the guys, oh, here we are, here's Jeff Heath. These would be the guys that Lou Boudreau would have to deal with, and he only had a short time to figure out a way to do that. And while Lou was making plans for the 1942 season, on December 7th, the Japanese launched a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. They decimated our naval staff. They killed thousands of sailors, wounded thousands more, and President Roosevelt declared war against Japan. Germany immediately declared war on the United States, and we would be fighting on two fronts: in Europe to fight Germany, in the South Pacific to fight Japan. Hundreds of thousands of young men would be drafted to fill the ranks. We weren't prepared to fight a war, let alone two different countries on two different parts of the world, but we had to go forward. And the result of that was a lot of men were taken away from their families and going off to Europe or the South Pacific to fight. And a lot of women, a lot of housewives were left to take care of the family with very little income. It was a difficult time. And this affected Major League Baseball. Guys were starting to get drafted, and this would affect a lot of people on the ball clubs. And probably the most famous guy to go in the armed forces was Bob Feller. And Bob wasn't drafted. He enlisted in the Navy in January of 1942. Bob probably could have waited. It may have taken a year or more for his number to be called, but Bob was a patriot. He didn't want to wait. He wanted to go and do his duty. So he entered the Navy, which was a great thing for him to do. But he was the best pitcher in baseball. And without him, the Indians were losing probably 25 wins, probably 300 strikeouts, and there was nobody to replace him. This is what Lou Boudreau had to face. His other issue came up shortly after when Hal Trotsky, our starting first baseman for many years, a big power hitter, a guy that could hit 30 home runs, drive in 110, 115 or more, bat 300. He suffered from migraine headaches. They'd gotten so bad in the late summer of 41 that Trotsky had to leave the ball club and go home. He couldn't see the baseball. The headaches were so bad, and he had blurred vision. So we had to come up quickly with another first baseman to replace Trotsky. So going into the 1942 season, there were a lot of issues for Boudreau to face. But as a rookie manager, he did fairly well. He was able to get most of the team behind him and move forward and make the team competitive. Now, while Feller was in the Navy, he was at Norfolk at the naval base there, and he would be going training for several months. If you want to go, if you want to stay with the slide from the Armed Forces All-Star game, this will work. He decided that there might be a good idea to have a benefit game while he was still in the Navy. And what was happening was the government was setting up a relief fund for families of soldiers and sailors that were killed or wounded in action. They would send them money to try and help them get through it. However, they were still working on setting it up, so a temporary relief fund was available. And what Feller wanted to do was bring a group of Armed Forces All-Stars, guys who were major leaguers that had been drafted, bring them to Cleveland in July, right after the American League and National League All-Star game, and have them play the winner of that game, and all the money will go towards the Armed Forces Relief Fund. It was a great idea. Alva Bradley, our owner, got the letter from Feller. He was excited about it. He got permission from the American League president, Will Harridge, to go ahead and plan the game for July 7, 1942. The Cleveland newspapers picked up on it, said all kinds of great things about it, and people were very excited to see this ball game. The All-Star game was played, the American League won, and the next day everybody took a train to Cleveland to Municipal Stadium to meet the Armed Forces All-Stars. Mickey Cochran, who'd been a catcher with Detroit, and a great one for many years, was the manager. He was at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center in charge of physical activity and all the ball clubs there. Feller would pitch a couple innings, and Johnny Rigney, a star with Chicago, would pitch most of the game because he went through spring training before he was called to service. So he was in shape to play, where most of the guys weren't. But some good guys were there. Cecil Travis, an excellent shortstop, was playing. Mickey Hafner, another pitcher, was flown in from the Panama Canal just to pitch in the ball game. But these guys had a big task ahead. They had to play against Lou Boudreau, who was an all-star, Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio. They didn't have much of a chance, and they lost the game 5-0. But at Municipal Stadium, 62,000 people attended the ball game, and they raised over $100,000 for the relief effort, which was a tremendous thing, one of the biggest events that had happened to date. It was really a great moment for Cleveland and for Cleveland sports to accomplish something like that. Feller would go back to Norfolk for some more training, and before the summer was over, he would be sent to the South Pacific, where he was on the battleship USS Alabama, where he was in charge of one of the big guns, one of the big anti-aircraft guns, and Bob would be overseas until 1945, a great loss for Cleveland baseball. The ball club would go back and forth. They'd win some games, lose some, and they'd finish with a record of 75-79. They'd be in fourth place. But with a new manager, 24 years old, and Feller gone and Trotsky gone, that really wasn't too bad for the ball club. They had found a first baseman in Les Fleming, who they got from the minor leagues, and Fleming did a good job. He wasn't Hal Trotsky, but he hit 280 and knocked in some runs, and that did help him. In the September of 42, the Indians decided to call up some ball players. One of those was Eddie Robinson, who would later become our starting first baseman, and he would play in the 1948 team and help us win the pennant and World Series. And unfortunately, you may have saw it in the paper or online, Eddie passed away yesterday. He was the last remaining member of the 1948 team. He was 100 years old, which was amazing. And what was remarkable, when I was working on Victory on Two Fronts about 3 years ago, I got Eddie's phone number and I gave him a call, and he called me back, and he sounded terrific at 97. And we talked a lot about the 1948 World Series and Eddie's career and his teammates, which will be in the book, hopefully, that's coming out in a few months. But one of the guys that came up was Allie Reynolds. He was a pitcher, and he'd be a mainstay on our staff through half of the 1940s. Allie was a Native American. His mom was a full-blooded Creek Indian, and Allie had, unfortunately, the stigma of being a Native American, and he would take a lot of abuse during his time in the majors. His guys would call him Chief and Super Chief and all kinds of other names, but he was a tough guy. And he would tell people after a couple of times, he'd sit down and he'd say, look, that's twice you've called me this name. If you do it again, you and I are going to have a serious conversation. What he meant was, I'm going to fight you and I'm not going to stop till you stop. So people began to respect Reynolds, but he showed almost right away what a really good pitcher he was. He went to college. He went to Oklahoma A&M, where he was a football star and a track athlete on scholarship. He was very fast. He was a halfback. In one ball game against another team out in, I believe could have been Nebraska, one of those schools, or Kansas, Allie took a handoff on the 1 yard line, broke a couple tackles, and ran 99 yards for a touchdown. Got a lot of attention all around the country. He was a great track athlete, a good sprinter, could do everything. One afternoon, he was practicing with the track team. The baseball team was nearby working out, and Allie was throwing the javelin. And the baseball coach, Hank Iba, who had become a famous basketball coach, saw this guy with really great form and throwing a javelin unheard of distances. And he thought, this guy's got a really strong arm. At the time, Iba had 2 pitchers with sore arms. He was having trouble finding someone to throw batting practice. So he motioned to Allie and told him, what'd you think about coming over here and throwing batting practice? I see you've got a strong arm. And Allie thought that would be fun. So he went and he threw practice. And Iba watched him and thought, he just has not just a strong arm, but this guy can really throw and accurately. And he asked him if he'd like to join the varsity baseball team. Though he wasn't on scholarship for that, Allie agreed. Within a year, he was the best pitcher on the staff. At the time of his graduation from Oklahoma, he was one of the best pitchers in the United States. Allie was drafted by the New York Giants of the National Football League, but he was also, the Indians were after him to sign a contract, Cleveland Indians. He thought it over about what was better, and he realized he could probably make more money if he played for the Cleveland Indians. The NFL wasn't paying very well at the time. So he forgot about football and signed with Cleveland and would become one of our stalwart pitchers through the early part of the 1940s and all the way through 1946. Now, going into 1943, the War Department got together with Major League Baseball, and it was decided no more trips down south to Florida or to California. Because of travel restrictions, players were needed to stay home. And the best thing they could do was to go to a place like Indiana and work out there. The New York teams worked out in upstate New York. The Indians chose Lafayette, the home of the Purdue Boilermakers, where they had a nice field house there. And that's where the Indians practiced indoors. They had hoped in March the weather might clear. They could play 16 exhibition games outside, which would be very difficult to do. As we know, usually the weather in the Midwest in February or March, it's not time to play outdoor baseball. It's next to impossible. So they worked out inside the field house. They shared it with Navy recruits and the Purdue relay team. They were able to get some things done and make the team a little bit better with some additions that they made. And they would play some of the exhibition games, but most of the time it was too cold to play. So they'd start the 1943 season with really very little experience in game action, particularly the pitchers who had very little chance to get loose. So 43 would be difficult, not just for the Indians, but for all the teams in Major League Baseball. And I believe at the time, about 9 ball clubs played in Indiana. So you didn't really have to travel to play another team. You just go 40, 50 miles on a bus, which was okay. But trains were taken up by recruits going to bases and being transported. Hotels in the South were also being taken by recruits in the Navy and the Army to be housed. That was the reason for the travel restriction. And of course, using fuel was needed for the war effort. So baseball players had to cut back on the teams on the travel that they did. We did have some decent ball players in the 43 club. Jim Bagby Jr. was our #1 pitcher. He was the son of Jim Bagby, our great pitcher from the 1920 World Champions who won 31 games that year. Bagby Jr. was born on Linwood Avenue, right across from League Park. It was destined he'd be a member of the Cleveland Indians. And he did have a fine year, winning 17 ball games for us and was really an excellent pitcher at the time. Mel Harder was also on our ball club. Mel had arm surgery in 1941, but he fought his way back and was fairly effective in 1943. The next year, Mel would reach the 200-win plateau. We had a promising outfielder, Hank Edwards, who was from Norwalk, Ohio, a young guy that was a good hitter with a lot of speed. He joined the ball club and helped us out. Unfortunately, he'd have a collision with Jeff Heath, and he would break his shoulder and be lost for most of the season. Mel would slide into second base in the game he was pitching, and he would break his ankle, and he would be lost for several months as well. Our fortunes were really reversed in 43, where we might have had a chance to do some damage. So the Yankees were losing players right and left. Joe DiMaggio was gone. Tommy Henrik, an Ohioan, was gone as well. Some of their pitchers. There was a chance to advance in the standings. With these key injuries, the Indians weren't able to do much, and 1943 went in the books without much progress. That year, Major League Baseball really kicked in their fundraising to send money to the troops and the relief fund. If we could go back one slide, I think you'll say with Mel Harder. Thank you. What Major League Baseball did, they would designate a day where all 16 teams played and all the proceeds would go to the war effort. They also have other individual events. My favorite was in New York, where there were 3 ball clubs, the Giants, Brooklyn Dodgers, and the Yankees. And there was an effort made to recruit businessmen and CEOs and bankers to go ahead and buy a ball player with war bonds. And he would be like, you're a ball player for the season. And some of the ball players, the great ones of the Dodgers, went for $10,000 or $12,000 in war bonds. And they had a competition where your guy, you would follow him. And if he got a base hit in the game, you'd buy another 1,000 in war bonds. If he hit a home run, you'd buy another 10,000. Same for the pitchers. If they won a ball game, you might put in 5,000 in war bonds. If they threw a shutout, you put in 10,000. By the end of the year, they had raised hundreds of thousands of dollars in war bonds, donated all the profits to the government. They were outstanding in doing that. The All-Star game, most of the proceeds went to the armed forces, and the World Series as well. Major League Baseball was a big contributor to the war effort. By 1945, they had donated well over several $1 million to help families and equipment, and also the USOs and the Red Cross. They even had what they called a bat fund, where guys would kick in money and they would send large shipments overseas to South Pacific and to Eastern Europe of bats, balls, catcher's masks and gloves and uniforms. And when guys had some leave of a week or two, they might go to a safe place in Europe, organize a ball game and play for 7 or 8 days. And then they could leave the stuff there. Other guys would come over, use the equipment and play ball. Even in fact, in one effort in the South Pacific, the Marines and the Navy had bombarded an island. The Japanese had retreated and they had left the island. When the Navy went ashore, they found out a very new baseball field had been laid out by the Japanese, probably just a few months before. It was in great shape. They immediately had an impromptu game by all the ex-ball players who were on ships in the area were sent ashore, and they played servicemen and had several exhibition games with thousands of troops watching them. Baseball really did their part to help as much as they could throughout the entire war. In May of 1944, Mel Harder finally got to that milestone. He won his 200th ball game with the Indians, and he was a very happy guy. Nobody deserved it more than Mel Harder. He was a Clevelander his entire career, starting in 1927. He was well into his 30s, but still a good pitcher. And it's been quite some time since the Indians had anyone who had won 200 games in their career. So Mel was one of our leaders, really in all-time stats at the time, even though Feller had been around much less time. Feller and Harder were near the top of all the stats that we had. Mel would stay with the ball club. He would win another 13 games and finish his career with 213 wins. Really an outstanding guy, a really good guy who later would coach the pitchers for many, many years. That same year, actually just days after Harder won his 200th game, the Allies landed at Omaha Beach in Normandy, France. This was an effort of over 150,000 Allied troops from the US, Canada, and Britain, hundreds of ships and air support. It's a tremendous battle on the shores there to drive the German army away and get a foothold on that beach to advance into Eastern Europe. The Germans had stubborn resistance. It was quite a fight for several days, but within about that time, the Allies had taken over, secured the beachhead, and were now on the march towards Paris to liberate Paris. People back home in the States knew this was the turning point of the war. With the Allied forces secure in France, going to take Paris, the next move would be towards Germany, and possibly the end of the war would be in sight. This was something that everybody had been waiting for, and the hope was there that maybe the war in Europe could end soon. The South Pacific, it was still raging. Nobody knew when we could defeat Japan, as they were a very stubborn opponent and would literally fight to the death and then some. That same year in 44, Steve Gromek came up for the minors, became a member of the Cleveland Indians. Steve would be a mainstay for a number of years and be a big contributor in 1948. Lou Boudreau won the batting title, the first and only one that he would win. He would hit .327 to win the title. He led the league in doubles with 45. He had 191 hits. It's a tremendous season for Lou, who is becoming a fairly good manager, and his playing career took off as well. This was probably his best year in baseball, but he would have another year in 1948, which was remarkable, which would help us win the pennant at that time. Rumors came along in 1945 in April that the war was coming to a conclusion in Europe. Allied forces were on the brink of Germany, marching towards Berlin. And word came to Cleveland that Bob Feller had been given orders to leave the South Pacific and come to the Great Lakes Naval Training Center in Chicago. And that meant it was imminent he would be receiving his discharge. Bob spent 3 years overseas and won 7 battle stars, participated in numerous battles, was a great sailor and leader, and really was a fine man and a great person to look to in that he didn't care at all about all the time he lost in Major League Baseball. He would say many times, I have no regrets. I wanted to fight for my country, and I did, and baseball had to be second. Bob really was a true American and did quite a service for our country. At Great Lakes, they announced that Bob would manage the Great Lakes baseball team. He wouldn't be doing any pitching, which everyone was kind of surprised at. But a few weeks later, the Navy reversed its decision and said they had a shortage of pitchers, so they'd have to throw Bob in there and he'd have to pitch every 4 days or so. But I think what was really going on, they knew that Bob was getting out, he would be getting his discharge. They wanted to help him get in shape to rejoin the Indians, hopefully in August or September of 1945. And Bob got to be pitching regularly. The hope was he'd rejoin the team for at least 5 or 6 games at the end of the year and use it for a springboard in 1946. It did happen in August. Bob was able to leave the Navy, get his discharge, and come to Cleveland to pitch. It was amazing. His first start, he beat Detroit. He went 9 innings, pitched very well, only gave up 2 runs. It was like he never left. And he would be successful in late August and through September, which gave us a really big boost going forward to 1946. It was outstanding what Bob did and was back on the ball club. We had other guys returning pretty soon, like Bob Lemon would be coming back home, and some others would really help the ball club in 46 and the years going ahead. Now, in the fall of 1945, the owners had their meetings, which they did every year, and they met with Judge Landis, our longtime commissioner. He'd been commissioner since 1920, when after the Black Sox scandal, where the White Sox threw the World Series, it was Landis who was named commissioner. One of his first acts, he banned 8 of those ball players for life. It showed everybody he was a no-nonsense commissioner, and if he didn't toe the line, he'd be in big trouble. So he ruled baseball for 25 years. They offered him a new contract for 3 years for $65,000 a year, a great salary for that time. However, the judge wasn't feeling well. He was ill, and a month later, he would pass away. And Major League Baseball would have to pick a new commissioner for only the second time in the history of the game. They looked at a lot of names and made committees to decide who they might look at. One of the names was J. Edgar Hoover, who they thought might make a really good commissioner, and he was interviewed in one of the candidates. They said it would take several months for it, but everyone wondered who'd be the new commissioner and what he would be like. In April of 45, unfortunately, President Roosevelt had passed away. He was gone. Harry Truman was now president. Roosevelt had been a big friend to baseball. When the war broke out, a number of owners thought, what are we going to do for the 1942 season? Maybe we should cancel baseball. They weren't sure what to do. But Roosevelt said, nonsense. We want baseball to continue. It's a great outlet for our workers and our families to forget their troubles for a few hours, going to the ballpark, having a hot dog, and relaxing. This will be great for everybody, and let's keep baseball going. And Roosevelt was a big supporter throughout his term, but unfortunately, he died in 1945, a great loss to the country, to the world, and to baseball as well. Harry Truman would do a fine job, but it was quite a transition and a very quick one, which nobody was expecting. About a month later, a new commissioner was named, and that was Albert Happy Chandler, our senator from Kentucky. He got the nickname Happy because he was always smiling, had a good disposition, and he was someone you could talk to. A great politician, had friends, Democrats and Republicans, could get things done, and he was given the job to replace Judge Landis. The All-Star game had been canceled because of travel restrictions, but one of the first things Chandler said was he would do his utmost to restore the game and get people to come out, watch the ball players, and money would be donated if there still indeed was a war effort. In May of 45, the Germans had surrendered. They'd given up. Hitler had killed himself, and the war effort ended in Eastern Europe. And as a result, ball players as well as others got their discharges and came back home. The first prominent ball player was Hank Greenberg, who came back to the Detroit Tigers after being gone for over 4 years. Gradually, more ball players would come home, replenish their team's rosters. Baseball would get back to normal, but really not until the start of the 1946 season. If we could have our next slide, we take a look at that. One of the most interesting guys was Bob Lemon, who'd been in our farm system and then was fighting in the South Pacific. Bob was an outfielder and also a third baseman. He wasn't a pitcher. He came to spring training. He played very well in the outfield. He was a starter on opening day as our center fielder. He played well out there, made some excellent plays, participated in a game-ending double play where he caught a ball for out number 2. The runner tagged up. He threw a bullet to the infield, got the runner out, and we won the ball game. People say, Lemon, he's a great outfielder, but he couldn't hit very well on a regular basis. As each game went by, he'd go 0 for 4, 0 for 4, and Boudreau realized he probably wasn't going to cut it out of the field. But in the South Pacific, Lemon had done a lot of pitching, and some of the ball players that came back said, you ought to try him as a pitcher. He's got a good fastball. He can throw a curve. He could probably be pitching for us. And Boudreau thought, why not? You know, he's on the roster. And he told Lemon, let's work on pitching and we'll put you in the bullpen. It would take a little while to learn how to be a major league pitcher, but Lemon made steady progress. And in 1947, Lemon would be one of our starters, a very valuable member of the ball club. So Lemon now on the bench, but practicing his pitching. And a ball club in 46, we have Feller back and pitching very, very well. Bob was after the strikeout record. He would get it, have an excellent season, just be really outstanding. We had other ball players who were doing well coming back. Ken Keltner was back at third base. We had missed him. He had been in the Navy. He was playing well. Boudreau was at shortstop. We had a bit of a hole at second base, and first base was a bit up in the air with who we would be playing over there, Les Fleming or Eddie Robinson. We had good outfielders as well, but we needed some help, but there was promising things in 1946. With the season not even half over, heading into July, rumors surfaced all around Cleveland that a gentleman named Bill Veeck was interested in buying the Cleveland Indians. What was happening was the team wasn't for sale. Alva Bradley had no intentions of selling the ball club. Now, Bradley, though it's important, he was a minority stockholder. He owned 25% of the stock in that neighborhood, but he'd been running the ball club since 1927. The other stockholders stayed in the background and let Bradley do everything, hire the managers, fire them, make all the arrangements with the city for leases at League Park and Municipal Stadium, player trades. Bradley was very important in league meetings on lots of committees. So he ran Cleveland baseball. Everything was his decision. Bradley would tell the papers, the stories are nonsense. I've never met Bill Veeck, never had a conversation. It's simply not true. But unfortunately, it was true for Alva Bradley. Veeck had his sights on Cleveland, and he had his people out there and found out that Bradley wasn't a majority stockholder. There was a way to unseat him. And Veeck came to Cleveland under an assumed name, stayed at a hotel, and started to talk to people about what they thought about the Indians. And the more he listened, he thought this would be a good buy. But this was very underhanded what he did. I think he really stabbed Bradley in the back. He went to visit with each stockholder without Bradley's knowledge and told them his intentions. He wanted to buy their stock and take over the Indians. These stockholders were interested because a number of them were the sons or the wives of the original stockholders who had passed away. They had very little interest in the team. They had some loyalty to Mr. Bradley, but they were listening about a way to unload their stock and make a profit with it. Veeck had just about everybody in line. The guys he needed were the Sherwin family. John Sherwin was a close friend of Alva Bradley. The two of them had helped buy the team in 1927. Sherwin owned about 25% of the stock as well, but he had died and left the team to his wife and sons. And they had no interest in baseball whatsoever. So they listened to Veeck, and Veeck had 75% of the stock lined up to buy. He never even spoke to Alva Bradley, and was just going to make, I guess, what you call a hostile takeover of the team, and Bradley would be out. However, I guess the Sherwins had a little change of heart, and they told Bradley what was happening. He was stunned. He had absolutely no idea. So quickly, he organized a meeting of the stockholders. The sale was to take place on a Saturday. Bradley pleaded with the stockholders to meet with him Saturday morning, which they did. Bradley told them he was willing to buy 100% of the stock to buy everybody out and take full control of the team. However, it would take him several months to raise the capital, but he would do it. And Bradley was a very wealthy man. He owned a ton of real estate in Cleveland. He owned railroads. He would have been able to do that. But the stockholders talked it over and they thought Mr. Veck had made a legitimate offer and he'd made it first. So they turned down Bradley and they went ahead and signed on with Veck. Now, Bradley knew that only 25% of the stock, he would just be a figurehead. So reluctantly, he sold the stock as well. And Bill Veck had the control of the Cleveland Indians in July of 1946. It was an awful shock to Bradley. It was said in the newspapers the next day, he went to the Indians game in his usual box. They said he looked ashen. His face was pale. He didn't speak. He was a stunned man. He'd go on to be very wealthy and live a number of years, but I'm not sure he ever got over losing Cleveland and the way that it happened, that it was basically done behind his back. Beck came into town. He was a showman, a promoter. He told folks he was going to make all kinds of changes. It was too late to make trades. The deadline had passed. But Veck had said, starting in 1947, the team was leaving League Park and would play all their games at Municipal Stadium. Beck promised all kinds of promotions to get fans to the ballpark. He installed a switchboard at Municipal Stadium with multiple phone lines. You could call there direct to buy tickets or ask questions, and somebody would be there to speak with you. He opened satellite ticket offices in Akron and Canton, and Veck went out on a speaking tour to speak to any group in Greater Cleveland and Northeast Ohio to plug the Indians and push his product. He'd speak to a group of 30 people or 300. At times, he'd make 2 speeches a day, selling tickets and talking to people. His stockholders included Bob Hope, our former Clevelander and the great comedian in the United States, one of the most popular guys. Hope saw the opportunity to make some money and really further his career, also as the part owner of the Indians. And this would be something that Hope would hold on to until the 1960s. Veck had been in baseball for a long time. His father was the general manager of the Chicago Cubs. Bill worked a lot of different jobs with the Cubs, and he learned a lot about baseball. But he was a showman. He was a promoter. And what he loved to do, he bought the Milwaukee franchise in the American Association in 1940. He'd have all kinds of promotions for people. And what he would do, he'd have giveaways. They were very silly, but people liked them and came to the ballpark. He'd give away fish, baskets of peaches, rabbits, bunnies, turtles, ducks, all kinds of silly things, clothes. And gradually he filled the ballpark and was very successful. In 1941, he entered the Navy, where he was a gunner and fighting for the Marines. And unfortunately, he had a terrible accident where one of the heavy machine guns he was working was knocked off its placement and fell on his leg and crushed it. Veck would have numerous surgeries and be in the hospital for a long, long time, and he would sell his interest in Milwaukee. When he came home, he just bided his time, but by 1945, he was thinking he wanted to get back into baseball and started searching for a ball club. And in 46, he found the Indians and became the owner. In 47, he started with a bang, all kinds of promotions. He hired a band full-time, the Mellow Makers, who entertained people in between innings. He had strolling musicians in the stands to play songs to people. He hired acrobats to perform, magicians. He had cowboys doing rodeo tricks, anything at all to bring people to the stadium. With his promoting and tireless work, in 47, we were soon getting crowds of 50,000, 60,000, and pushing up to 70,000 on the weekends per game. He reached the 1 million mark, heading towards 2 million, breaking all Cleveland attendance records, and was doing a fantastic job. One of the first things he did was trade Allie Reynolds for Joe Gordon, the all-star second baseman from the Yankees. And now his infield had Eddie Robinson, Joe Gordon, Lou Boudreau, and Ken Keltman, probably the best infield in the American League. And then Veck would make a landmark decision in July of 1947. If we could have our next slide, we could put that one up there. He had been watching what was happening in Brooklyn, where Jackie Robinson had been signed to break the color barrier in Major League Baseball. Robinson played for Brooklyn, was a star. And the key thing about Robinson was he was able to hold his temper in check and not say a word when people baited him. They yelled all kinds of racial insults from the stands. Other players would spit on him. Pitchers would throw at him. But Jackie kept his cool because he wanted to pave the way for other African-American athletes. Veck was looking for someone to do the same. He searched the Negro leagues, and everyone told him the best player out there was a young man named Larry Doby. And Veck talked to the Newark owner, offered $10,000 for Doby's contract. In July, Doby became a Cleveland Indian. Larry had served in the war in the Navy, was a great baseball player, football player in high school, track star, basketball star, had a scholarship to Long Island U to play basketball, but early in the 40s, he was drafted into the Navy. He managed to play a few games with Newark before he was called into service, and Larry was lost until 1946. But he came to Cleveland determined to once again show that African Americans had a place in Major League Baseball. His debut was in Chicago. He played first base, replacing Eddie Robinson, which caused a real controversy because Robinson was so upset he wouldn't give up his glove. It took about a half an hour to convince him to give up his glove to let Doby use it, which was a real problem. But later Robinson would say it wasn't so much Doby, he wasn't being racist. He believed he was losing his job to Doby and would be sent to the minors, and was furious about what had happened. Doby played there, but the problem was Larry was an outfielder. And there was, or rather an infielder, I should say. There was nowhere for him to play in the infield with the guys we had. And you couldn't teach him to play outfield in a couple of days and throw him out there. So he sat on the bench most of 47 and hardly played, while Jackie Robinson was an everyday player. So Larry bided his time. He went to spring training in 1948 and learned how to play the outfield. Tris Speaker worked with him. He was a coach. And so did Hank Greenberg, who Veck signed to be a help in the front office. Hank was with them working. Larry learned how to play the outfield, and very well. So he was a starter by opening day of 1948. Dale Mitchell was another outfielder for us who had just come up from the minors, a really good hitter. With Doby and Mitchell, we had two fine talents out there. Veck had really helped the pitching staff. He had Feller, he had Lemon, he had a new pitcher in Gene Bearden, who he got into trade from New York. Bearden threw a knuckleball, which was really hard to hit, and he had great success in 1948. He would be a 20-game winner. With Feller, Lemon, and Bearden, the team was outstanding with great pitching, great hitting. Veck kept adding ball players to bolster the team. Later in 48, in July, he signed Satchel Paige to come and pitch for the Indians. The owners in Major League Baseball accused Veck of doing it just to get people in the ballpark for the fun of seeing old Satch pitch, because Satch was in his 40s. But Satch was still outstanding, and he could still pitch. Down the stretch, he won 7 ball games for us and helped us to win the pennant. The Indians would be in first place most of the year. They faltered in September. They fell 4 games out, but rallied. The Yankees and Boston lost some games. At the end of the season, we were tied with Boston for the pennant. The first ever playoff game had to be played between us. It was in Boston. And in that game, Lou Boudreau hit 2 long home runs. Ken Keltner hit another one. Gene Bearden pitched. We won 8-3 and got the right to advance to the World Series to play the Boston Braves. The Braves had a great team. They had 2 outstanding pitchers in Johnny Sain and Warren Spahn, a good overall ball club, good hitters. This was going to be a very difficult matchup. You may have heard the saying they would say a lot in Boston, Spahn and Sain in 2 days of rain, because they were the 2 top pitchers and almost guaranteed to win every time they went out there. Game 1 was in Boston. Bob Feller pitched his first time in the World Series. He and Johnny Sain had a scoreless duel going into the bottom of the 8th inning. The Braves got a runner on first base. We got a man out. There was a sacrifice, a walk. There were runners at first and second with 1 out. When the Indians put on their pickoff play, which they had a really good one, they did it all season long. Boudreau would flash a signal from shortstop to his catcher, Jim Hegan, our great catcher. Hegan would flash it to the pitcher. They both would count slowly, 1, 2, 3. The pitcher would whirl around and fire to second, and Boudreau would be flying there, grab the ball, and tag the runner. And it worked about 3 or 4 times during the season. Phil Macy was the runner on second. Boudreau called the pickoff play. It worked perfectly. Boudreau put the tag on his shoulder, but the umpire, Bill Stewart from the National League, was caught flat-footed. He wasn't paying attention. He was out of position. He called Macy safe. Boudreau argued and argued and argued, but he wouldn't change his call, and the play stood. Of course, Tommy Holmes came up and lined a base hit. Macy scored. We lost the game 1-0 and failed to lose a chance to win a World Series game. Later, photos from the game and film was taken and then distributed as highlights in 1948, clearly showed Macy was out. He was about 3 inches away from the bag when Boudreau tagged him out, deprived Feller the chance to win a World Series game. We bounced back strong. We won the next 2 games. Game 4 was in Cleveland, and Steve Gromek was chosen to pitch. Steve had only pitched as a spot starter, but he'd won 9 ball games out of 12, hadn't pitched in 2 weeks. So Steve was on the mound facing the Boston Braves. This was a key game. If we won it, we went up 3-1. If we lost, it was even at 2 games apiece, and the Braves still had 2 more games back in Boston if necessary. Gromek pitched wonderfully, probably pitched the game of his life, and he won it 2-1. The winning hit was a long home run by none other than Larry Doby to win the ball game. Fans were ecstatic. There was over 80,000 people in the stands setting records everywhere, standing room only. Folks went into the locker room. The reporters were there. If we could see our next slide. If we can get the next slide up. Oh, I think we go back 1. I think we skipped 1. We could try and go back 1. Oh, I guess we lost it somehow. Okay. Well, we had a picture of Steve Gromek and Larry Doby. The reporters asked Doby and Gromek if they would pose for a picture. And they were both so happy, just 2 athletes, of what they had done. Gromek reached out and gave Doby a big hug, and the 2 of them hugged and smiled as photographers snapped their picture. And I guess I must have lost it somehow. I apologize. I had a picture of the 2 of them there in that famous pose. But the picture went out to newspapers all across the country, and it showed a black man and a white man celebrating a terrific win. It was just 2 ball players. It was nobody else. And that started a break for Larry Doby in getting accepted into Major League Baseball. And Gromek really did a terrific thing by doing that. He was not a prejudiced man. He was friends with Doby. He was so excited to win. He just gave him a bear hug, and his 2 of them smiled. The picture was snapped, and it was a great moment. Unfortunately, we'd lose the next game. It was Bob Feller's last chance to win a World Series game, and he was knocked out of the box. The Braves had 3 homers over him, and we lost the game and had to go back to Boston. Bob Lemon started for us. Nobody knew he had a sore arm. All night long, he was sleeping or trying to sleep on heating pads on his elbow. And then in the morning, trainer Lefty Wiseman was working on his elbow for hours, but he gutted out 7+ innings of good pitching. We had the lead, and Boudreau called on Gene Bearden, who had been our hero all year long, to finish the game. Bearden did it. We won the World Series 4-2, and we were champions of the world after a 28-year drought. Everybody was excited, came back to Cleveland. We had a grand parade down Euclid Avenue with over 100,000 people attending the parade. All the guys were in convertibles with the tops down, waving to the crowd. It was a great moment in Cleveland history, but unfortunately, we still are waiting to repeat it. It's been all those years since us getting to the World Series and winning again. In 1949, it looked like the Indians were the team to beat. We had a really good season, but we came up short for the Yankees. The guys got older. Boudreau and Keltner and Gordon all had career seasons in 48, but they were in their early 30s and getting older and weren't playing the way they did the previous year. Doby was great. Mitchell was great, but we finished in 2nd place. We wouldn't get back to the World Series till 54, and we would lose it then. Bill Veeck, our great promoter, who had done so much for Cleveland, broken all the attendance records, outstanding. He sold the ball club unexpectedly in 1949. Veeck was going through a divorce. He wasn't a guy that kept money on hand. He constantly spent it on various things, mostly on the team. The only money he had was the stock in the Indians, which he was setting up a trust fund for his children. So he was forced to sell the ball club, and he did. And Veeck was out as the owner of the Cleveland Indians, and our fortunes did not recoup for many, many years. It would take us years to get to another pennant again in 54, which we lost, unfortunately, 4 straight games to the Giants. But 1948 was a magical year for us. We had a tremendous year, did great things, and brought a pennant and a World Series victory home to Cleveland. Well, that's my talk for this evening. If anyone has any questions, if we can handle questions, or if anyone had any comments they wanted to make.
Oh, Scott, this is Gail. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you fine.
Okay. I do have a question or a comment. recently there was an article, it was an editorial in the Plain Dealer about a week or so ago that called 1948 the most magical or the best season in baseball, or maybe even in sports. And the point being was that Boudreau had to win the World Series. If not, there's the gentleman who wrote the article said that Veck had wanted Boudreau to give up managing, and that if the only way that he could, remain the manager was to win the World Series, which he did. And I believe that Boudreau put up tremendous stats that year, not only as a batter, but also as a shortstop. And I wondered if you had read that article or had heard that about, Boudreau having to give up being a manager if he didn't win.
I think I did see the article, and there is some truth to it, but I'm not convinced he would have fired Boudreau. Veck wanted to, when he bought the ball club, thought about replacing Lou immediately with a veteran manager, but the fans were up in arms. It didn't happen. Going towards the 48 season, Veck had made noises about he was going to replace Boudreau and trade him to, I believe, Boston for Vern Stevens and get another manager there. I think Veck did not think Lou was a great manager. He loved him as a ball player, but I think it was pretty obvious if he had fired Lou as manager, Lou would want to go ahead and play somewhere else. He would want to come and just be a ball player. I'm hearing something on the speakers. I'm not sure where that's coming from. But I think there's some truth to it, but I don't think he would have necessarily fired Lou, because the Indians were going to have a great year regardless in 48. If they had finished second and won 94 ball games, how do you fire the manager? That'd be pretty difficult. Plus Lou hit 355, his career high, hit 20 homers, knocked in 100 runs, was tremendous all throughout the season. So I think, yeah, there's some truth, but I don't think Veck would have gone ahead and done it. Lou was too popular, and he was a good manager, maybe not the greatest, but the Cleveland fans would have hated Veck for that, and really it would have hurt attendance and caused some issues. So I think it's overstated just a little bit. I think Lou was somewhat secure as manager. Unless the team finished in 7th place, yeah, Veck probably would have chopped the axe. But the team was going to have a great year regardless. You could tell in May they were going to have a great year. So I don't think Lou was in serious jeopardy then, as Veck bowed to the will of the people. And I think Lou would have stayed.
Okay. And I have, and I just wanted to mention that if anyone is having any questions or comments, they can type them in the chat room. I put chat room, sorry, chat box. I'm sorry. It's been that kind of an evening. Technology is wonderful when it works. I'll just have one other question. Any chance that Mel Harder may make the Hall of Fame ever? You think, or is that?
I think Mel's time has passed. There was a movement, I think, tried to get him considered for the Hall of Fame because he won 213 games. That's quite an accomplishment. And I think Mel was in with that group of players that are right on the edge. They're very close to it, but if you voted Mel in, there's probably 30 other guys that were similar you'd have to look at. I think Mel was worthy of the Hall of Fame. I do. However, the board, I guess, felt that his career was excellent, but not quite good enough to be in the Hall of Fame. And Mel was a tremendous pitcher. To win that amount of games is quite an accomplishment. Usually, I think the rule of thumb is if you win 200, you get considered for the Hall. And Mel, I guess, might have been considered, but he didn't get in. I think his time has passed. I don't think at this point his name would come up again, which is a shame. But in Cleveland baseball history, Mel is in the top 5. I always think of the best pitchers we've ever had. Of Cy Young, Bob Feller, Addie Joss, Lemon, and I think Mel belongs there, was just fantastic. And a great Clevelander. He stayed in Cleveland and was a great guy, lived in Chardon and was always around to help people out and things at the old stadium and then at the new progressive field at the time. So I think it's tough on Mel. You know, if somehow he could have found a way to win another 20 games, maybe at 225, yeah, he might have got in, but I think he was as close as you could get without getting in.
Okay, thank you. I have one final question, and you're free not to answer it, but we've got the 2 books, and now we got the 3rd one coming out. do you foresee another book, or is this one, the Victory on Two Fronts, will that be it for you?
I'm not sure at this point. I'm thinking about it. My intent originally was to cover the team from the 1920 World Series through the 1948 series in 3 parts, have a trilogy, and that I've completed. That was my intent. So now I'm there, and I'm not sure what to do next, thinking about it. The 50s, a lot has been written about the 54 Ball Club. There's biographies of Rocky Colavito that are recent and very good ones, and quite a bit about the 54 guys. And I believe a bio of Al Rosen is on the way too. That area has been covered pretty well. So I'm kind of, right now I have to work on the index for the new book, which is a project in itself. And to do that, trying to, like I use the name Bob Feller about 103 times in the book. I've got to make sure I have every single page documented without a miss. So it takes a while to do that. When I finish with that, take some time off and think about what I might want to do. But I'm not sure. I guess it's not a great answer, but I'm not sure what the future holds there.
Oh, well, thank you. Does anyone have any questions? I would like to thank Scott for a wonderful presentation. I am a huge baseball fan, and I enjoy your books. I enjoy your presentations. It's like talking to a friend. A friend that's knowledgeable in the area of Cleveland Indians baseball. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming out tonight, and also for being very patient with us, with our tech issues. Technology is wonderful when it works. And when it doesn't, you have something like we had at the beginning of tonight's presentation. Thank you again, and look forward to eventually having people come back into the building and attending in-person presentations. That's our goal. All righty. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.
My pleasure.
Here. Okay, I will click end meeting. Okay.
Okay.
My screen's
Trying to figure out how to get out of here. It's not showing me.
Is it showing end meeting?
No, because I think you're controlling it from your end. So I don't think I can. I think you have to like log me out, I think.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting then. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Scott.
Oh, thanks, Gail. I had a great time.